Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today we are continuing our discussion with delegates to the First Continental Congress by moving over to Pennsylvania. The gentlemen's names you see next to me are the delegates to the First Continental Congress from Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania was extremely important at this point. The Continental Congress itself was held in Pennsylvania, not just because it was centrally located, although that was nice, but also because Pennsylvania was arguably up there with Virginia as the most important, wealthiest colonies in the colonies. Philadelphia itself was the one of the largest cities and the largest city in the British Empire outside of Great Britain itself, or I should say England proper. This makes it, again, an extremely important place. And that's why these delegates are so important. And also, they're very interesting because they come from a variety of backgrounds that you might not expect. So let's start with the first person you see next to me, John Dickinson. Now, John Dickinson, fortunately, has become a lot more popular over the last few years, or at least more well known. Dickinson is one of the most important American founders. Here he is at the First Continental Congress. We'll see him 13 years later at the Constitutional Convention. Even at this point, Dickinson has already become fairly famous because he had written letters from a Pennsylvania farmer throughout the late 1760s arguing against much of this taxation, and his authorship became known, and it made him wildly popular in the American colonies. So sending John Dickinson to the First Continental Congress was kind of a no-brainer. He's one of the few lawyers there. He would go on to write the first draft of the Articles of Confederation, though he didn't support the declaring of independence and therefore takes a step back for a few years and does not sign that document. Now, we're not going to get too far in the future, but let's suffice to say he does continue to serve the Patriot cause, becomes governor of Delaware, governor of Pennsylvania, and as I said, signs the United States Constitution. So don't be too mad at him for that. Up next, we're going to move down the list to John Morton. No relation to Morton Salt, though I do like to call him that because it's a lot of fun. John Morton was, for all intents and purposes, a farmer, though he had, at a young age, been elected to the Pennsylvania Assembly, and he did several things. Basically, I don't want to call him a statesman, but more along the lines of a bureaucrat for several years leading up to this point. He's really the main government person for all the people you see next to me. Now, no known image on John. I'm sorry, there is an image. Nope, it's the next person doesn't have an image. That's John Morton. That's what he looks like. John Morton, actually, he comes from, his father was Finnish, and his mother had Swedish ancestry. I'll remind you that while England was settling most of the coast in the 1600s, New Netherlands, the Dutch settled New York and parts of New Jersey, but New Sweden was settled by Sweden in parts of Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. And John Morton does inherit, he is part Swedish and part Finnish, although 100% colonist. Now, Morton becomes one of the more radical people fairly early on when going to the First Continental Congress. He is reined in by some of the more conservative delegates at the time, though he does promote the resulting Continental Association that leads to the boycott that all of the delegates to the First Continental Congress do sign. Morton himself would go on to sign the Declaration of Independence. Sadly, he would die less than a year later, probably of tuberculosis, making him the first signer of the Declaration of Independence to pass away, which sadly for him is what he is best known for. Moving right along, we have Samuel Rhoads. Now, Rhoads was a carpenter. He was an important carpenter. He led the Carpenters Association. He oversaw construction of some really important buildings, such as the one you see next to me, which is next to me is Independence Hall, though the First Continental Congress met at Carpenter's Hall, which was a building Rhoads was involved in the construction of. Rhoads, for a delegate to the First Continental Congress, very little is actually not known about him, but it's very hard to dig up information on Samuel Rhoads. He was a longtime friend of Benjamin Franklin. He participated in the construction of many of the things Ben Franklin is known for, the hospital, parts of the College of Philadelphia, dozens of buildings throughout Philadelphia that still stand. Rhoads was in some level involved with. Very interesting about Samuel Rhoads is that October 1774, while he's at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, he is elected mayor of Philadelphia. Now, when things get hot and heavy with the British and the independence is on its way, Rhoads does step aside, but he remains in Philadelphia this entire time. He doesn't end up going anywhere. So he's not a loyalist, but he does kind of step quietly, gingerly into the back and watch from afar. But he is an important member of Philadelphia society. Moving right along, we have Charles Humphreys. Now, Humphreys is best known as a miller. He owned several mills. He is very cautious with the radicalness of the First Continental Congress. He, along with, as we'll see, Galloway, at this point, Dickinson and Rhoads are all very moderate and very conservative. They are not pushing for extreme measures like you might see Morton, Mifflin, Ross, and Biddle pushing for a little bit earlier on the lead up to independence. Now Humphreys, again, no known image, and we've pretty much gotten through him. He was more of a side player. He was a miller, found his way into the Continental Congress, did serve in the Colonial Assembly for a while, as almost, I believe, every single person from Pennsylvania had at some point. When independence comes along, again, he just kind of hides in the background and pretends he never said anything because he doesn't want to leave Philadelphia, but he also doesn't want to be part of that radical delegation. However, that leads us to our next person. Joseph Galloway counts as a founding father, despite the fact that he ends this war as a loyalist. So, heads up on that. Now, Galloway is extraordinarily important. He is the Speaker of the Pennsylvania Colonial Assembly at this time when they go to the First Continental Congress. Additionally, when Paul Revere shows up to the First Continental Congress with the Suffolk Resolves, written by Dr. Joseph Warren, Joseph Galloway follows that up by bringing his own plan. It's called the Galloway Plan of Union. He presented it to the First Continental Congress, and what he wanted to do was, instead of issuing this boycott, which was essentially saying, we don't want to play with you anymore, Mr. King, what Galloway was saying is, here, we can use this plan to remedy the situation we are in. And that plan more or less created a second parliament for the colonies. They would still be responsible to the king, as Parliament was in Britain, but the American Parliament would not be responsible to the British Parliament. There was a weird, veto system where they could double back on each other. It's kind of complicated. It's very complicated. And that's one of the reasons no one really went for it. But the Galloway Plan of Union is extremely important. And it makes Joseph Galloway and the issuing of this plan one of the most important people and events of the 6.5 weeks that the Continental Congress, the first one, met in Philadelphia. Now we're going to move along to a name you might recognize, Thomas Mifflin. Not only is he a namesake for the TV show The Office, as I like to joke, Thomas Mifflin, at this point, was a merchant. Probably the wealthiest delegate from Pennsylvania, which is interesting because most of the other colonies sent some of their wealthiest people. Thomas Mifflin, not so much. Now, he was extraordinarily wealthy. He had trained under the Biddle family, which we will talk about another Biddle member at this point, but he had learned the trades under the Biddle family. A wealthy merchant from Philadelphia. He ends up going and joining the war. He's extremely important, becomes part of the Conway Cabal, ends up going to the Constitutional Convention. Becomes a president of the Continental Congress. He already is extremely wealthy and represents the wealth of Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress, and would go on to be an extremely important player thereafter. And I should note, when we talk about the wealth of Philadelphia, I was saying earlier about how important Philadelphia was, how large it was. There was nothing to say at that point. If you would ask someone in the colonies, hey, in 200 years, what's going to be the wealthiest, most powerful city in America? Some people might have said New York. Most people would have probably said Philadelphia. Some people would have argued Boston, Charleston, but Philadelphia was, for all intents and purposes, looked like to be the city. So this man was representing really the moneyed interests in what looked to be the biggest city of the future, though that's not how it worked out. So we're going to move right along here to George Ross. George Ross, I believe, uncle or cousin to Betsy Ross. He was one of the more radical people. He came along pretty quickly. Ross ends up, he was a lawyer. Like John Dickinson, he was the other lawyer here. He came in as representing the legal system. He had been in the Colonial Assembly for quite some time. It makes a lot of sense that he would show up here. Not too much to say about George Ross, although I will say he does sign the Declaration of Independence, and that's a lot of fun. We're going to carry on here to Edward Biddle because there's a fun story with Biddle. So, as I said earlier, Thomas Mifflin had studied with a member of the Biddle family. The Biddle family, again, this one has no known image, but the Biddle family is a very large, important family in Philadelphia. They are financially interested. They kind of stay out of the gruff and grind. Many of them, there's so many of them doing such small things throughout the Revolution that we overlook them as a whole, as their importance as a family to the Revolution. None of them really stand out and have these big momentous speeches or battles or anything like that, but they all participate, some in war, some in politics, some in finance. They participate throughout, and the Biddle family is extremely important, as one of our viewers, Jan, would like to point out, as she is a member of the Biddle family and likes to contact us about it. Thank you so much, Jan, for all the information you provided me over the years. But I do want to bring up about Biddle because, as I said, Joseph Galloway was the Speaker of the Colonial Assembly when the First Continental Congress happens. Everyone ends up, they vote on the Galloway Plan, which only loses by one vote, mind you, because they're not ready for independence, these guys. But once the result, they agree to the Continental Association, which is the boycott, and they send a Declaration of Rights and Grievances over to England. Once that's all settled, they go back, and the radicals in this group, again, primarily Dickinson. Dickinson is kind of a radical, but kind of not, although he's like the leader of the radicals, but also one of the moderates. He's a very interesting character. But Dickinson, Morton, Mifflin, Ross, and Biddle go back to the assembly, and they're like, hey, this is what's going on, and they make a big stink about it. Governor John Penn, and yes, Penn as in Pennsylvania, still a relative of the Penn family that owns Pennsylvania, literally owns Pennsylvania. He calls in a session of Congress, and he wants Pennsylvania to send its own delegates to Great Britain to basically say, hey, as governor of Pennsylvania, I don't want anything to do with this Continental Congress. I just want to get Pennsylvania to be on a good playing field with King and Parliament. You can come and throw armies at all the other colonies, Your Majesty, but I want to make sure Pennsylvania is all okay. And that he does a very democratic thing. He calls together the Colonial Assembly, and the Colonial Assembly votes it down. And instead, they decide to rescind for the Second Continental Congress several of the more moderate people and send more radical people. And it is the efforts, especially of Ross and Biddle, and Morton, that they push forward and start trending towards a more independence-minded attitude. And the reason I say this for Biddle is because when they have a new election in the Colonial Assembly, and Galloway is removed as Speaker of the House, and Edward Biddle takes over. And he holds the position of Speaker of the House through a huge portion of the beginning of the American Revolution. And again, that's the thing about the Biddle family. They're one of those families that is extraordinarily important, but they're in less sexy roles than other families or other citizens might be. You know, Thomas Mifflin has a bunch of war hero things. John Dickinson writes the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution, parts of it. Very sexy. I should also note, and I forgot to say this about John Morton up top there. John Morton actually went to the Stamp Act Congress about 9 years before this, which meant he had already gone to a Congress of this nature with people like Philip Livingston of New York from the Livingston family, and John Rutledge of South Carolina from the Rutledge family. He'd already met with these people, and that was extremely, extremely important. Because as we've said before, some of these people had a bit of difficulty communicating with each other because we think we have different dialects now around the country. Well, imagine if there was no internet or TV and you literally didn't know how English was spoken 800 miles away. So that's a brief overview of the Pennsylvania delegates to the First Continental Congress. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, definitely hit like and make sure you subscribe. We're in Pennsylvania now. We got a bunch more states to go. We're heading south, so come along for the ride and check out the previous videos of the states to the north. Thank you again, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.